Chapter 1 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lily. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 1, Naughty Pinkie. Mrs. Bunny had laid the breakfast, and now she was very busy stirring the porridge over the fire to keep it from burning. Every now and then she stopped to listen. This was because she did not hear the children getting up, and she was afraid they would be late for school. It was quite half an hour since she had called them, and then little Pinkie had complained of a sore throat and said he did not feel well enough to get up. Mother Bunny paid little heed to this remark. He was often ailing on Monday morning, but usually got much better as soon as the others had started for school. You see, Pinkie was rather a lazy little thing, and he simply could not bear sitting on a hard bench all the morning and doing sums and dictation. So all his brothers and sisters were in a much higher class, although they were younger than he. All this was rather worrying for Mrs. Bunny, and whilst she stirred the porridge, she tried to think of a way to teach Pinkie to be a good boy. At last the kitchen door opened, and little Percy appeared. He was followed by Patty and Tatty, the twins, and Tiny Tim, the youngest of the family. They had all washed their faces nicely and smiled as they entered, knowing that their mother would be pleased with them. They took their places round the table, and Mrs. Bunny gave them each a little bowl of porridge. Then she said to Percy, "Why isn't Pinkie ready? It is the third time he has been late. He says his cough is too bad, and if he goes out in the cold wind, it will be the death of him," answered Percy. "Very well," said Mother. "He shall stop in bed today. Now get your satchels and run off to school directly you have finished, whilst I go and put a mustard plaster on Pinkie's chest." Mother then went out of the room carrying a large tin of mustard. At the door she turned to call back, "If you are good, you shall have plum pudding for dinner." "Oh, how lovely! Oh, how lovely!" cried all the children, clapping their hands. "We shall be very good, dear Mother." And they flew to the row of pegs where their hats and bags hung. Pinkie was lying in bed, picking the feathers out of his pillow, and then blowing them up to the ceiling. But when he heard his mother coming upstairs, he turned over and closed his eyes. As she came into the room, he groaned a little, and then coughed. "Perhaps I was too hard on him," she thought as she came up to the bed, and Pinkie coughed again. Then he opened his eyes and said in a feeble voice, "A little water, a little water, I am choking." His mother, now quite alarmed, ran to get some, and when Pinkie had taken a few drops, she told him to lie very still while she went to fetch Uncle Badger. Uncle Badger was a doctor, and none of the children liked him very much, because he used to pull their ears and give them nasty medicine. "I don't want Uncle Badger," moaned Pinkie. "He always makes me worse." But Mother was already on the landing and did not heed him. Pinkie hated medicine and gruel, which he knew he should be forced to take if Uncle Badger came. He thought Mother would have wrapped him up in a shawl and let him sit by the fire with his best toys, as she usually did when he had a cold. He wished now that he had not coughed quite so much. After picking some more feathers out of the pillow, he scratched a little paper off the wall. Then there seemed nothing left to do in bed, so he got out and wandered round the room and found it very dull. Suddenly, he saw a large blue bottle fly crawling on the window. After that, he spent quite a happy time trying to catch it, and indeed, he was so busily engaged that he did not see Mother and Uncle Badger coming up the garden path. But they saw him, and Uncle Badger laughed and said, "Well, my dear, I'm afraid that young rogue of yours has been cheating you again. He doesn't appear to be very ill." Poor Mother was almost angry. "He really must be punished this time," she cried, and she and Uncle went into the parlor to arrange what was to be done. "I'm sure a good fright is the only way to break him off these tricks," said Uncle 5 minutes later as they went upstairs. Pinkie was curled up in bed again and looked most unhappy when they entered. He made his teeth chatter and complained of the cold in a sad voice. The doctor glanced at Mrs. Bunny and shook his head in a sorrowful manner. "This is very sad," he said, as he felt Pinkie's pulse. Dear, dear, why wasn't I called in sooner? Of course, I shall do all that I can, but it will go very hard with him. Mother stood by the bed with her apron held to her eyes. The first thing we must do is to put on some strong mustard plasters, Uncle Badger went on, one on the front and one on the back. Don't weep, dear, but fetch me a kettle of boiling water. Yes, yes, let me do anything that I can to save my child, sobbed Mrs. Bunny. When she had left the room, Uncle Badger pulled Pinkie's ears. Now mind you do all that I tell you and drink your medicine, or it will be the worse for you, he said severely. Yes, Uncle Badger, murmured Pinkie in a very frightened little voice. He had a horrid feeling that he must be really ill, although he had been quite comfortable until Uncle Badger came into the room. How dreadful it would be if he could never go into the lovely fields any more, or dance with his little friends in the moonlight on the hilltops. Whilst Pinkie was indulging in these mournful thoughts, Mother and Uncle Badger were busily engaged at a small table mixing the mustard for his plasters and speaking together in low tones. As they came towards the bed, Uncle Badger said, "Of course, he must not be left alone a single minute. You had better let me send Nurse Raven to look after him. Your hands are full enough already with all the other children." "Oh, no, no!" cried Pinkie in quite his natural voice. "Nurse Raven is horrible, and she pecks me if I move. I don't feel a bit ill now." And he sat up in bed. "Poor child, how very sad. It is the fever. He is delirious, you see," whispered Uncle Badger. Aloud he said, "There, there, you will soon be better. Lie still and let me put this nice mustard on your poor little back." Pinkie struggled, but it was of no use. Uncle Badger held him firmly by the shoulder, and soon the plaster began to burn. "I will bear it until he is gone," thought naughty Pinkie, "and then I can tell Mother I feel almost all right and quite well enough to get up for dinner. I don't want to miss the plum pudding I heard her promising the others they should have." But Mother did not seem so kind as usual. As soon as Uncle Badger had departed, she poured out a large cupful of yarrow tea, which she made Pinkie drink, in spite of his cries. "Pinkie, Pinkie, I'm ashamed of you," she said. "You must be good if you want to get well quickly. Uncle says you are to take this every 2 hours and only a little water gruel for a week. Then perhaps he will let you sit up for a short time in the afternoon." "I tell you, I don't feel ill. I'm quite well. I'm quite well," stormed Pinkie, pushing the cup from him. But Mother only smiled and said, "You're very ill, my poor little boy. You have no idea how ill you are." And she shook her head sadly. Then there was a tap at the door, a nasty sharp tap, and when Mother said, "Come in," it opened, and there stood Nurse Raven. She looked very severe. Her hard gray eyes flashed like steel and seemed to say, "I'll teach you to pretend you are ill." She curtsied to Mrs. Bunny, at the same time saying that Master Mole was going to bring her boxes later, as the doctor told her not to wait for anything but to come at once. Mother Bunny thanked her and said she must go and see about the dinner, or there would be nothing for the children when they came back. Pinkie cried and held her hand, but she drew it gently away, and the next moment he found himself alone with the terrible Nurse Raven. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Lily.
Chapter 2 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dwarika. You can follow me on my blogspot, lifearounddwarika.blogspot.com. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 2. Pinkie Escapes. Even before Nurse Raven came, Pinkie had begun to repent his folly. But before the day was over, he would have given anything not to have had that stupid idea of pretending to have a cold. At first he hoped Mother would soon come back so that he could tell her how sorry he was to have been so naughty, and what a miserable little creature he felt. Every time he whimpered or called out, "Mummy," Nurse Raven gave him a sharp peck with her hard beak, which hurt very much, and told him to be quiet at once or to lie still. And whenever Mrs. Bunny did come upstairs, Nurse Raven ran to the door and said that he was just going to sleep, or that it was better not to come in and excite him, so he hardly saw his mother at all. Poor Pinkie had never been so unhappy. He lay there from hour to hour, taking his gruel and nasty medicines very meekly, and doing without a murmur everything that he was told to do. In fact, he was such a model young rabbit that Nurse Raven began to relent a little. Towards evening she came and sat beside his bed. Oh, how it made him shiver to see her beak so near him. And taking out her knitting, she said she would tell him some stories to cheer him up. Pinkie knew what sort of stories they would be. He had heard them before, all about the cruel and heartless tricks of her friends the weasels, a family hated by the bunnies, but much admired by Nurse Raven, who was never tired of talking about them. "I expect you would like to hear about dear Billy Weasel and the foolish field mouse. All my little patient love that story," she began. Pinkie could not bear the story, the end of which made his blood run cold, but of course he was obliged to say he would like to hear it very much. "I must try not to listen," he thought, "or I know I shall cry, and then she will be angry and pet me for not laughing." So when Nurse Raven went on and on with the dreadful details of how poor little Father Field Mouse tried to escape from Willy Weasel, but was caught just before he reached his home and safety, Pinkie closed his eyes and thought about the happy family downstairs. He could hear the cheerful rattle of tea things and Percy's joking voice as he scraped a piece of toast which he seems to have burned, judging by the smell which came up through a little crack in the floor. "Oh, if I had not been so silly, I should be down there too," he groaned to himself. "Now I don't know how I shall ever escape from this horrid room. Nurse Raven never goes to sleep, and she won't let anyone come near me. Oh, what shall I do?" A ripple of laughter broke in on his sad thoughts. So that was the end of Father Field Mouse, and when his wife came to the door and saw his tail hung up for a knocker, they say her heart broke and she fell down on the mat quite dead. What do you think of that for a funny story? Pinkie looked at Nurse Raven with shining, wide open eyes. "I don't believe you are listening, or you would laugh," she said angrily, making a peck at his long ears. But he was too quick for her and slipped under the blanket. A sudden thought had come to him. If he could put out the candle, perhaps in the darkness he would be able to reach the window, and then it would be easy to leap out and escape. There was a nice parsley bed outside which would break the fall. "Come up, naughty child, come up at once," cried Nurse Raven, catching hold of what she thought was a Pinkie under the quilt. But it was really only the pillow which he had pulled down on purpose. Pinkie himself had slipped out on the other side of the bed, and dashing underneath it, he seized the leg of the little table on which the candlesticks and medicine bottles stood. There was a crash, then darkness, and with one bound he was at the window. For a moment he thought he was lost, for he could not find the catch. He heard cries and the shuffling of feet behind him. Happily, the glass was brittle. It cracked and splintered, and a minute later Pinkie found himself lying among the soft parsley, panting and bleeding, but free. He felt rather dazed, but he knew he must not give way yet if he wanted to get out of the clutches of Nurse Raven. Aunt Hedgehog will save me. Aunt Hedgehog will save me. He kept murmuring, and the thought seemed to give him new courage. Dragging himself to the hedge, he crept through it and limped toward the wood. A little glimmer of light showing between the trunks of the tree told him that Aunt Hedgehog was at home, and he knew she would take pity on him. His foot hurt him very much, but he struggled on manfully. It seemed ages before he reached the door, but at last he got there. Just as he was about to knock, the door opened with a rattle of chains and grinding of boards, and in the flood of warm firelight he saw Aunt Hedgehog coming out to fill her kettle. Oh, how happy Pinkie felt as, with a little cry, he ran forward. My goodness, what was that? Cried Aunt Hedgehog, dropping the kettle and drawing back. But almost at the same time she saw Pinkie, and held out her arms. In a moment he was in them, and sobbing out his story. Aunt Hedgehog did not say a single scolding word. She only waited until he was calmer, and then she began to put on her shawl and bonnet. Don't be afraid, my dear, she said, as she saw Pinkie's look of terror. Of course, you shall stay here, but we must let your poor mother know, or she would be crazy before morning if she thought her little boy was lost. I just ran over and tell her you are all right and very sorry for causing her so much pain. You sit in the big armchair until I come back. Then we will see about making up a little bed for you. And she bustled off. Pinkie felt very much ashamed of himself. How kind Aunt Hedgehog was, and dear mother too. He wished he could do something to please them. He thought and thought. The best thing is to be very good and not tell fibs and go to school, I expect, he said at last. But that's so easy. I wish I could do something special. He went on drowsily as his tired little head dropped lower and lower on Aunt Hedgehog's comfortable cushion. End of chapter 2. Recording by Dwarika.
Chapter 3 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 3. Kind Aunt Hedgehog. Pinkie stayed at Aunt Hedgehog's for about a week. His mother had forgiven him for being so naughty. His leg, which he had really cut rather badly when he jumped through the window, was almost healed, and he had been a good little rabbit all the time. He used to get up early, help Aunt Hedgehog to fill her kettle and cut her firewood, and do all he could to make himself useful. So he felt very happy, which quite surprised him, because he had always thought it would be very tiresome to be obliged to do this sort of work. But Aunt Hedgehog was so kind it was a pleasure to do anything for her. And as he still limped very much and wore a large white bandage on his bad leg, he felt no great desire to run about or get into mischief. He sometimes slipped out into the road and had a quiet game of marbles with Sam and Ted, Master Mole's two boys. And once, I am sorry to say, he went off with Watty Whiteface, the farm cat's naughty little boy, to steal eggs. But happily they saw Count Reynard across the brook and ran home again before any harm was done. All the land for miles round belonged to Count Reynard, and everybody was terribly afraid of him, because he had such a cruel heart and never showed any mercy. He was also very quick and very cunning. If you wanted to be safe, it was best to keep in the village street or in your own garden. Of course, some of the more daring young creatures rather enjoyed the excitement of meeting the Count, and Pinkie was one of the most daring. There had been times when he wondered if he would ever return to tell his adventures to his friends, but all this was carefully kept from Mrs. Bunny. It was not kind or wise to speak of Count Reynard to his mother, Pinkie had long ago found out. Something dreadful had happened to Father Bunny not long before Pinkie was born. He had never dared to ask what it was. Percy knew, Pinkie felt sure, but Percy was always so important when he had a secret, and would never let you share it, however hard you tried to worm it out of him. Pinkie was puzzling over this mystery for the 1000th time, while he gathered up the chips round Aunt Hedgehog's chopping block, when he heard her calling to him from the window. "Pinkie, my dear! Pinkie, come indoors for a moment. I want to speak to you about a little plan I've got in my head." Pinkie picked up his basket of chips and ran to the house very quickly. When he entered the kitchen, Aunt Hedgehog's first words made him rather disappointed. "Next week you will be well enough to go back to school," she said. But when she also said, "I have been thinking we might give a picnic before you leave me, and invite all your little friends," he felt quite cheerful again. "Oh, Aunt, how lovely!" he cried, clapping his paws. "Yes, I know it is, my dear," answered Aunt Hedgehog. "That is why I thought of it. You have been very good while you have been here, and this is to encourage you to go on being good when you get home again. Now, let me see. We had better decide on Saturday, as it is a half-holiday, and also Uncle Badger and Master Bobtail" Master Bobtail was the dear, kind sheepdog "will be able to get off. I must tell you that Uncle Badger and Master Bobtail were the only people of whom Count Reynard was afraid, so, of course, it was very important to have them at all the picnics." Aunt Hedgehog went to the cupboard and took out a box of tiny notepaper and a little bottle of ink. "Now you must write the invitations," she said, "while I am busy making cakes and pies. I will just rule the lines for you, and then you can manage nicely if you don't take too much ink in the pen." So Pinkie pulled a chair up to the table and counted out the sheets of paper he would need. 1, 2, 3, 4. What a lot of little friends he had, to be sure! Every time he thought he had finished he seemed to remember one more, until at last there were 22 small envelopes lying neatly addressed around him. The invitations themselves took rather longer, but, as Aunt Hedgehog said, the same words would do for all of them, and he would only have to put a different name to each. So Pinkie wrote 22 times, "Dear Blank, we are going to have a picnic on Pine Tree Warren next Saturday. Will you come? We shall be so pleased if you can. Your loving friend, Pinkie." He really wrote it 24 times, if the truth must be told. Once a large drop of ink fell just on the word pleased, and when he tried to wipe it off with his handkerchief, it made a horrid smudge and spoilt everything. And the other time, the pen was doing a beautiful capital P for picnic, when it suddenly got naughty and stopped, and then kicked, so that there was a little hole in the paper and a lot of tiny spots of ink all round it. Pinkie felt angry with the stupid pen, but he did not want to break it, as it belonged to Aunt Hedgehog. So, putting it gently down, he tore up the 2 spoilt pages and wrote them again. Then he made a list of all the names of his little friends, like this: Ted and Fred Waterrat, Polly and Tim Cottontail, Bob Squirrel, Peggy Partridge, etc., until he had put down all the 22. After that it was easy to put a name to each invitation, crossing them off the list as he did them one by one. Aunt Hedgehog looked in every now and then to see how he was getting on, but she was too busy to help him. Her hands were covered with flour, and a lovely smell of baking came from the scullery where she had her little oven. It made Pinkie so hungry he was very glad to find it was dinner time when he had finished his writing. "This afternoon we must go to the village and order some lettuces," said Aunt Hedgehog, when she had washed up the plates and things. "Put all the letters into my bag, and we will post them at the same time." Pinkie hung the bag round his shoulders. It made him feel he would like to be a postman. But when they reached the village, The volunteer rats were going by, and he thought he would rather be a brave soldier. Before bedtime that night, answers came from nearly everyone, saying they would be very pleased to come on Saturday. "We shall have to gather cowslips for the wine all day tomorrow," said Aunt Hedgehog as she tucked Pinkie up in his little bed. "I think we must ask Mother to let the others come and help us." Pinkie made up his mind to get up extra early. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dwarika. You can follow me on my blog, lifearounddwarika.blogspot.com. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 4. The Picnic. The day of the picnic arrived at last. Pinkie woke early and found the sunlight streaming in at his window. Dressing quickly, he went downstairs to light the fire before Aunt Hedgehog was up. He felt so happy that he could not help whistling whilst he worked. Master Tortoise brought the milk and spoke gloomily about red at morning, shepherd's warning, and fine before 7, wet before 11. But Pinkie only laughed and told him he would be mistaken this time, as it was going to be the brightest day in all the year. Master Tortoise shook his head as he slowly moved off, carrying his 2 nice bright milk cans. Pinkie and Aunt Hedgehog did not have time for much breakfast. There were all the letters to be washed and the baskets to be packed by 10 o'clock, as well as the usual housework. However, everything was ready before any of the guests came, and Aunt Hedgehog was standing smiling at the gate in a charming new bonnet and clean apron, with Pinkie beside her, when Uncle Badger drove up in his dog cart. "How are we this morning?" he cried as he got down. "Now I'm going to enjoy myself. No more work till tomorrow. My patients will have to take care of themselves for today." And he laughed and pulled Pinkie's ears. By this time quite a little procession was coming up the road, and Aunt Hedgehog was kept very busy, shaking hands and saying, "How do you do?" Most of the mothers and a few of the fathers had come to take care of their children, so the party was even larger than they had expected. But as Mother Bunny had brought a huge cake and Master Gobbler a basket full of hard-boiled eggs, there was no fear of a shortness of food. Just as everyone was ready to start, Master Bobtail hurried up. He said he was sorry for being late, and that he had hardly been able to get off at all, as several of the lambs were teething and very feverish and fretty. He really did not like leaving them for the whole day, but his nephew Towser had promised to see after them carefully. Then, looking rather serious, he turned to a little group of parents. "There is one bit of news I learned last night which is annoying," he said. "It seems that Count Reynard and the weasels are also giving a picnic today, so we must be extra careful." Some of the mothers grew pale, and the smiles faded even from the fathers' faces. But they really felt quite safe with Uncle Badger and Master Bobtail. It was simply the thought that they might meet these enemies which is for a moment seemed to cloud the brightness of the outing. The weather was so glorious and all the young people in such high spirits, it was impossible to feel sad for long, and as they drew near Pine Tree Warren, both grown-ups and children were as merry as could be, chasing each other round furze bushes and playing tricks with the heavy baskets, which they left in the middle of the path For the good-natured one to pick up again, Billy Cottontail, one of Pinkie's cousins, was a great favorite, and he made everybody laugh. When he grew up, he was going to be a clown. Everything he did made you laugh. His way of walking, his way of talking, but most of all his funny little face. He could say quite rude things without being punished, just because he had such a nice smile. And though he was very young, even fathers and uncles wanted to do things to please him. Today he was at his very best, and even Cousin Gander, who was usually rather vinegary, could not help laughing when he loaded himself with two large baskets and said he was Master Tortoise going his round. On reaching the warren, there was a great discussion as to where the feast should be spread. Some of the ladies thought near the dew pond; it would be so handy for the washing up. The gentlemen all voted for the sandy bank under the biggest pine trees. They said it was an ideal spot on which to lie and smoke while the others were clearing away afterwards. Of course, the children wanted it to be in the center of the fairy ring, and as the picnic was really for the children, Aunt Hedgehog decided to have it there. Four lively young bunnies immediately began to unfold the snowy cloth, when there was a crackle of breaking twigs on the other side of the bushes. Every head was turned in the direction of the sound, and there, not 100 yards distant, they beheld Count Reynard and his horrid friends, also just commencing to spread their cloak. Pinkie trembled when he saw Nurse Raven helping Willy Weasel to unpack a huge rabbit pie, and even kind Aunt Hedgehog looked pale and nervous at the sight. Poor Mother Bunny had already fainted, and as several of the other ladies seemed to be on the point of doing the same. Uncle Badger was very busy sprinkling pale faces with water. There too was dear Master Bobtail, hurrying a little party of the youngest children towards the path which led down to the village. A few moments later he came back, having left them under the care of Master Gobbler, who had kindly spread out his tail, which made a splendid screen, and completely hid them from sight. "Now, my dear friends," he said, "there is nothing to be alarmed about. All we have to do is to go quietly down to the village green. You know they dare not follow us there. I have started the children off safely, so really there is no reason to worry. Pick up the baskets and let us be off too." And suiting the action to the word, he made a pile of provisions and began to pack them up again. Several fathers followed his example, and soon the whole company were moving quietly down the green hillside. Count Reynard and his friends glanced at them and whispered to each other, but the fact was that when they saw Master Bobtail and Uncle Badger, they were nearly as much afraid as our little party, so nothing dreadful happened. But everyone seemed very quiet, even young Billy spotted joking, and it was not until they had reached the village green and seen the schoolhouse and the rows of tiny thatched cottages looking so safe and secure around its sides that tongues began to wag again, and the baskets were put down for the second time. Of course, this was not nearly such a nice place for the picnic, but still everyone was tired and hungry, and it was delightful to rest on the soft grass and know you were quite safe. Uncle Badger started the feast by opening one of the bottles of cowslip wine and advising everyone to drink two the health of Aunt Hedgehog, and the confusion of Count Rennet. So calm was restored, and if the picnic seemed to be in the danger of becoming a little tragic at one time, it went on merrily enough afterwards, as you shall hear in the next chapter. End of chapter 4. Recording by Dwarika.
Chapter 5 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The picnic continued. Perhaps the delay made everyone enjoy his food even more than he had expected to do. At all events, Aunt Hedgehog had much praise for her delicious pies and cakes. All the crisp lettuces which Pinkie had washed so carefully a few hours earlier were soon eaten up, and the cowslip wine made by the whole bunny family was agreed to be of the very finest quality. Poor old Grandmother Mole caused much fun by sitting down on a plate of wild strawberries, and when Uncle Cottontail, Billy's father, had helped her up and explained matters to her, she quite entered into the joke in spite of having spoiled her clean print dress. The young people thought it was splendid that such a very old lady as Grandmother Mole should be so jolly and not mind being laughed at. It made them all want her to like them, and she had a little crowd round her most of the afternoon offering to do things for her, and egging her on to tease Billy, who usually had everything his own way. Aunt Hedgehog was playing Ring of Roses with the very smallest ones, but she could hear Grandmother Mole's voices in the distance as she said, "Oh, you sly rogues," or, "When I was a young girl, we did not treat our elders in such a manner," and from its tone she could tell that the old lady was enjoying herself. All the little bunnies screamed when the game came to all fall down and immediately said, "Do it again." So Aunt Hedgehog knew that from the oldest to the youngest, the picnic was a success, and it made her very happy. Groups of mothers sat under the furze bushes, talking of their children and knitting or sewing. Uncle Badger had brought a pack of cards, and he and some of the fathers were sitting round an ant-hill, which made a fine table, and were playing a quiet game. Altogether, it was a very peaceful scene after the fright they had had before lunch. Pinkie and some of the other boys were on the sandy slope behind the haystacks. They had found an old tea tray, and were having a glorious time tobogganing. 4 of them could sit on it at once, and it simply flew down the slope. At the bottom it was bumpy, and you usually upset, but that made it all the more fun. Pulling the tray uphill again was not quite so amusing, but Master Bobtail was always ready to lend a helping hand. Once he even pulled it up with a boy still sitting on it, but he said he would not do it again. It made him too hot. And afterwards he sat down and watched them, offering a 3-penny bit to anyone who could safely gain the bottom without tipping over. It was not very expensive for him, as only one party did it, and then perhaps not quite fairly, because Bob Squirrel stuck out his leg and slowed down before they reached the stony part. At 4:30, Aunt Hedgehog called the boys and asked them to get some sticks and make a fire, so she might boil the tea kettle. By 5 o'clock everything was ready. Large plates of bread and jam and grass sandwiches, and in the very middle of the cloth Mother Bunny's splendid cake, all covered with white sugar and "Good luck to dear Aunt Hedgehog," written in pink on the top. This cake was a great surprise because Mother Bunny had kept it wrapped up in paper until the last moment, and everyone had thought it would only be an ordinary cake, without any icing. You may guess how much pleased Aunt Hedgehog was, and how the little ones squeaked and the big ones shouted. The mothers said it was a charming idea and wished they had thought of it, and the fathers smiled at Aunt Hedgehog and tried to catch her eye as they raised their cups of tea to their lips. This was even a livelier meal than lunch had been. The shock of the morning was forgotten, and the whole party felt that they had spent the most delightful day. Just as the last basket was being packed, a frightened-looking rook came rushing up and asked if Dr. Badger could come at once, as there had been an accident. It was feared that Nurse Raven's leg was broken. She had caught her foot in a rabbit hole when playing blind man's buff at Count Renner's picnic, and was now lying in great agony at Weasel Villa. Of course Uncle Badger had to hurry off, leaving Master Bobtail to take care of everyone. It must be confessed that Pinkie did not feel very sorry for Nurse Raven. In fact, he felt rather glad to think that now she would most likely have to stay in bed for a week without moving, and he wondered if anyone would sit beside her and tell her dreadful stories. Now that tea was over and Uncle Badger called away, there seemed no reason for going on with the picnic, especially as some of the little ones were beginning to get sleepy. So each guest thanked Aunt Hedgehog for the happy day she had given them, and said good night. Then one by one, they went away in the gathering dusk, and soon lights appeared in tiny cottage windows. Aunt Hedgehog, Mother Bunny, and Pinkie and his brothers and sisters were the last to go. Pinkie was very quiet as they walked home. He felt a little sad. All the week he had been longing for Saturday to come, and now it was over. Why did nice things end so quickly, he wondered. Only one more day with dear Aunt Hedgehog, and then school again, he thought, hastily wiping away a tear, which was slowly trickling down his cheek. End of Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mulligan. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 6. The Surprise. Every Sunday afternoon, Mother Bunny and her family took tea at Aunt Hedgehog's, and on this Sunday it had been arranged that Pinkie should go back with them afterwards, so that they could all start for school together the next morning. It was so much safer for the children to go about in companies. If anything serious should happen, one of them could always run for help. Although Pinkie was sorry to leave kind Aunt Hedgehog after the delightful time he had spent with her, he found it very jolly to have his brothers and sisters to play with again, and when they reached home, he thought what a nice, cosy little place it looked. What a long time it seemed since the night of his escape from Nurse Raven. He could hardly believe it had ever really happened. For some minutes past Percy and the other children had been whispering together. They often nudged each other and looked at Pinkie, but did not invite him to share their secret. On entering the kitchen, they begged Mother Bunny to light a candle quickly, and Tiny Tim seemed almost bursting with excitement. He jumped up and down and pulled at Mother's skirts so that she could hardly move. "What is the matter with you all?" asked Pinkie. "Wait a minute and you shall see," cried Patty and Fatty in chorus, as a match scraped the box and the candle was lighted. But Pinkie did not see anything unusual. There stood the table, with a row of little basins on it ready for supper. The chairs were in exactly the same places that they always had been in. The bright saucepan lids winked at him from their hooks over the fireplace, and the big clock ticked as loudly as ever behind the door. Percy had taken the candlestick from his mother and was leading the way towards the staircase. Patty and Fatty each seized one of Pinkie's hands and dragged him up the narrow flight to the landing. Tiny Tim followed, crying to them to wait for him. "Now shut your eyes until we tell you to open them," said the twins. And instead of stopping at Pinkie's door, they led him on down the passage to the large room which had always been used as a lumber room and for playing in on wet days. "Wherever are we going?" asked Pinkie, as he bumped into something. Now look, cried 4 eager little voices, and opening his eyes he saw a wonderful sight. The once untidy old lumber room was changed. Instead of dirty walls, cobwebs, piles of packing cases and broken furniture, he beheld a bedroom such as he and Percy had often dreamed of and had planned to have when were grown up and rich. The walls were covered with white paper, upon which a design of young lettuces entwined with pink clover and green oats was painted. It really made one's mouth water to look at. There were large coloured pictures from the Christmas annuals of a bunny's cricket match, and Pinkie's favourite general, Sir Benjamin Rodent, K.C.B., hanging up in nice frames. On the chest of drawers all his tin soldiers, and Percy's as well, were placed in rows, and at the far end of the room stood 2 dear little white beds. Of course it took Pinkie a much shorter time to see all this than it takes you to read it, and he made many sounds of delight and asked 100 questions of his brothers and sisters while he looked at everything. I chose the wallpaper and Mother put it up, said Patty proudly. Fatty wanted one with carrots and pampas grass, but I knew you would like lettuces better. Pinkie said it was the prettiest paper he had ever seen and was beautifully put up. Then he asked where the lovely red carpet came from. Why, that was kind Aunt Hedgehog's present, answered Percy. Didn't you guess we were making a surprise for you when you came back? How could he guess it? Said Fatty. We never breathed a single word about it when he was anywhere near. Besides, it wouldn't be a surprise if he had. Percy was beginning to reply rather crossly to his sister when Tiny Tim did something which made them all laugh instead. He had been standing by the fireplace and saying, Pinkie, do come and look, for some time, but they were talking so much they did not pay any attention to him. At last he could not bear it any longer, and pulling a handful of coloured paper out of the grate, he brought it to where Pinkie was standing, and spreading it about on the floor, said in a very proud voice, I cut up all this my own self. It took hours and hours. I wanted to hammer the carpet, but the others said it was too little. Pinkie patted Tim's head and said he had never seen paper so well cut. It was just like shavings. This pleased his tiny brother very much, and he ran out of the room. They heard him feeling his way downstairs in the dark and calling, Mummy, Mummy, Pinkie says it's just like shavings. It took quite a long time to see everything and hear how it had been made, and they had not really finished when Mother Bunny tapped on the kitchen ceiling to let them know supper was ready. Percy and Pinkie were in a great hurry to go to bed that night. They thought it would be so lovely to wake up in their beautiful room and find it still there and not only a dream. When Mother Bunny came to tuck him up, Pinkie put his arms round her neck. Oh, Mummy dear, I'm so happy to be at home again, he whispered, and I'm going to work very hard at my lessons, so you will never be sad about me any more. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Kate Mulligan.
Chapter 7 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 7, A Day at School. The school at Bunnyville was kept by Dame Owl. She was a very clever bird and greatly respected by everyone. Children who were taught by her always made their way in the world when they grew up, so you may be sure she had a great many pupils under her care. She managed her class quite alone, and in school hours was very strict. It was the only way to keep order, as some of the boys were very troublesome. It must be confessed that everything had gone on much more quietly during Pinkie's week of absence, and poor Dame Owl heaved a sigh of regret when she saw him coming up the road with his brothers and sisters on Monday morning. There's that tiresome lad of Mrs. Bunny's back again, she said to herself. Now he will be upsetting all the others, just when I've got them into better ways. Oh dear, how annoying! And she took her birch rod out of the drawer and dusted it. But before the day was over, she had to admit to herself that Pinkie seemed changed. At first, when she saw him bending over his slate, she felt sure he was only drawing ugly portraits of owls, but when she crept around his form, it surprised her very much to find that he was really working at his sums. Could the child be ill, she wondered? However, he was lively enough during the half-hour's recess. None of them jumped higher than he did in leapfrog or ran faster in prisoner's base. No, certainly his health was all right. And in the afternoon, when he came out on top in spelling, there was nothing left for Dame Owl to think except that he had turned over a new leaf and meant to work a little at last. In her heart she was very much pleased. But it won't do to show it yet, she said. This is only the first day. We must wait till he's been back a week or two. Pinkie found it even harder than he had expected to keep his good resolution. Sums were such horrid things, and made one so tired. It was so much nicer to make drawings of Dame Owl and show them to one's friends when her back was turned. But he thought of his promise to his mother, and of his lovely new bedroom, and after that, it seemed a little easier to add up the long rows of stupid figures. Spelling was not so bad. He had always rather enjoyed standing round Dame Owl with the others, and trying to spell a hard word before any of them had time to think of it. There was some excitement about it, and this pleased Pinkie, and by the end of the lesson you almost felt as if you had been running a race. After school was over, Bob and Fred Squirrel said they would walk part of the way back with the bunnies, their homes both lying in the same direction. As he had been shut up all day, Pinkie was full of fun, and no sooner had they reached the village green than he became very noisy. He got hold of Fred's new straw hat and rolled it along like a hoop. Seeing Fred's angry face, Percy called out Pinkie to stop, but he took no notice of his brother's warning. It is doubtful indeed if he even heard it, as he was far ahead and shouting all the time. Fred ran after him, saying, "I say, give me my hat. You're spoiling it." But still Pinkie paid no attention. Then a dreadful thing happened. A gust of wind caught the hat and carried it into the middle of a duck pond, where it turned round and round 2 or 3 times and then sank to the bottom. Fred flung himself onto Pinkie, and they began to fight. The others had come up by this time, and whilst Bob shouted, "That's right, Fred, hit him hard," Percy tried to stop them with the promise of a new hat. The twins stood side by side in floods of tears because they thought their dear Pinkie would be killed, and Tiny Tim screamed at the top of his voice. This lasted only for a few minutes, and then the best possible thing happened. Pinkie's foot slipped in the soft mud, and he and Fred fell together in the water. Fatty and Patty gave a cry of anguish, but Percy knew that the pond was not very deep, and he and Bob soon fished the fighters out again. Of course, they could not go on with the battle, and they both looked and felt very silly as they stood in 2 puddles on the bank, shivering and wet to the skin. Now that it was over, Pinkie was most unhappy and repentant. He had meant to tell his mother how he had tried to get on with his lessons, but all that would be useless now, when she saw his dirty clothes and heard from the others about his naughtiness. "When I get excited, I just forget about everything else," he said to Percy in a very sad voice. "It's no use in my trying to be good. I always do something stupid." Percy did what he could to comfort him. "I shall tell Mother you were top in spelling today," he said. "That will please her, you know." It was Patty who had the bright idea which saved Mother a deal of heartache. "I'm going to run on and get some of Pinkie's clothes," she said. "Come in at the back gate, and I'll throw them out of the window, and he can put them on in the woodshed. It's a pity to make Mother sad about the silly fight. We must dry his wet things tomorrow, when she's gone to visit Grandmother." So Mother Bunny never heard all about Pinkie's first day at school, which was just as well, perhaps, because when you come to think of it, nothing very dreadful happened after all. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Bunny Brothers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON. Chapter 8. Pinkie Leaves Home. The bunnies had an Uncle Drake, who was a sea captain, and one morning they got a letter from foreign parts saying his ship would be home on such and such a date, and he was coming to stay with them for a few days. All the children were very fond of Captain Drake. He always brought them wonderful presents and was full of the most exciting stories. He would sit by the fire or in the garden in summer with Tiny Tim on his knee and all the others crowding around. Then he would talk for hours of his adventures with savages and pirates. So, of course, when they heard he would shortly pay them a visit, they were simply delighted. Percy, who collected crests, asked Mother if he might have the one which was on top of Uncle's note paper. It was composed of 2 little colored flags with "Do or Die" written under it. As he was cutting it off, he happened to notice the date, which was written in the right-hand corner. "Why, he will be here this afternoon," he cried. "He says, 'Expect me in 3 weeks from today.' And it's just 3 weeks. The letter must have been delayed." This news caused a great commotion, as nothing was ready for a visitor. "You will have to stay away from school for once," said Mother Bunny, "and I'll give me a helping hand. Now, Pinkie, you run upstairs and hang the mattress out of the window to air. The twins can wash up the breakfast things while Percy and I are shaking the carpet." Tiny Tim was sent into the garden to pick a nice nosegay for Uncle's dressing table. How hard everybody worked! The house seemed like a hive of bees. It was in such a bustle. By 1 o'clock they had finished the captain's room, and the pies and the salads were ready for his supper. "Now wash your hands and faces, and eat your dinner quickly," said Mother. "There is still the parlor to be dusted, and then you must put on clean pinafores." The children had been watching at the gate for quite a long time before they saw the station cab coming slowly up the road. On the top were Captain Drake's huge sea chest and 2 bundles tied up in red handkerchiefs. Uncle himself was leaning out of the window, laughing and waving his telescope. How splendid he looked in his blue pea jacket and bright brass buttons. "You got my letter all right, then?" he shouted. "I was half inclined to send a telegram, but I knew I should find someone at home." He then kissed everybody in turn, and lifting Tiny Tim on his shoulder, marched up the garden path to pay his respects to Mother Bunny. Captain Drake had been a long voyage, so it was more than a year since he had visited Bunnyville. He found all his nephews and nieces very much grown. As they sat round the fire that evening, he turned to Mother and said, "You ought to let me have one of your youngsters. There's nothing like the Navy for getting 'em into shape." Mrs. Bunny answered that she could not spare any of her children, but she saw the look which came into Pinkie's eyes, and she knew that she would not be able to keep him at home, now that the idea of being a sailor had got into his head. She sighed because she also knew that it might be the best thing for him. Although he had been trying hard to stick to his lessons, it was easy to see that he really took no interest in them, all his thoughts being turned toward other things. So when she was alone with the captain the next day, and he again mentioned the subject, this time saying, "It's young Pinkie I've got in my mind, a fine lad of spirit, and will be no end of trouble to you. When he gets a little older, I should say—" She agreed to part with him on these conditions: firstly, that he really wanted to go, and secondly, that the captain himself kept a careful watch over him, and saw that he did not get into bad company. "You can trust me, my dear. No harm shall come to him on my ship," answered Uncle Drake with a smile. "And when he comes home on leave, my word, how proud you'll be of him." Of course, Pinkie was wild with delight when he heard the proposal. All the next week was devoted to getting his outfit ready. Mother Bunny wanted everything to be as nice as it possibly could, and Aunt Hedgehog came over every day and helped with the sewing. Uncle Badger presented him with a fine sea chest just like the captain's, only a little smaller, and several of his cousins joined together and brought him a tiny telescope. The day of departure soon dawned. Uncle Drake had engaged Master Tortoise's spring cart, which was to be drawn by his famous prize goat, so that the whole family might come to the harbor itself to see them off. Pinkie had hardly slept at all, and was out of bed and dressed in his little sailor suit before it was light. He heard his mother moving about downstairs and ran to help her for the last time. Just at 6, Master Tortoise drove up. He was as gloomy as usual, and told Pinkie a sailor's life was a very dangerous one.
"I don't hold your leaving your native village,"
he said.
"No good don't never come of it."
But no one ever paid any attention to what Master Tortoise said, for he was a born croaker. Mother Bunny tried to be cheerful. During the long drive she listened to Uncle Drake's jokes, but she found it hard to smile. At last the seaport was reached, and they drew up quite close to the harbor. Several of Captain Drake's crew were standing about on the quay, and when they saw him they ran forward to lift the children and boxes out of the cart. Captain Drake's ship, looking as clean as a new pin, was anchored close to where they stood, and a row of sailors were marching across the gangway with the last baskets of bread and other provisions. From somewhere on deck came a clanging of a bell, and there was a great noise of flapping sails and rattling chains. "Time's up!" cried Uncle Drake, patting Pinkie on the back. "Kiss your mother good-bye, and come aboard." End of Chapter 8. End of Bunny Brothers by Jacqueline CLAYTON.